June 26, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. The checkers match remained incomplete as Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald looked up from the board. The individual standing at his screen door had just introduced himself, but the appellation hadn't fully registered. MacDonald was absorbed in his game with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, the operations officer for Satan's Angels. The civilian repeated his introduction with a quiet self-assurance that caused MacDonald to pause. Charles Lindbergh. The Charles Lindbergh, America's preeminent aviator, was standing in a makeshift recreation hall thousands of miles from home, requesting authorization to discuss P-38 combat operations. What neither man realized at that specific juncture was that this interruption would fundamentally alter long-range fighter operations within the Pacific theater. The methodologies Lindbergh would impart over the ensuing 6 weeks would extend the combat radius of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning by nearly 400 miles, transforming what pilots perceived as impossible into established operational protocol. The narrative of how a civilian consultant doubled the range of America's premier twin-engine fighter is not merely a technical account. It is a chronicle of organizational resistance surmounted by undeniable proof, of pilots learning to trust mathematical principles over gut feelings, and of one man's specialized mastery of fuel efficiency steering the course of aerial combat in the Pacific. The calculations for extended range were being codified not in technical manuals, but in the everyday experiences of aviators who would discover that everything they had been instructed regarding engine management was incomplete. The unattainable was on the verge of becoming commonplace, and the instructor was a 42-year-old civilian who had not piloted a P-38 until 3 days prior. The pathway to that screen door in Hollandia commenced 17 years earlier over the Atlantic Ocean. On May 20th through 21st, 1927, Charles Augustus Lindbergh had irrevocably changed aviation by flying 3,600 miles from New York to Paris solo in 33.5 hours. The Ryan NYP monoplane he commanded, the Spirit of St. Louis, carried 450 gallons of fuel in tanks so capacious they obstructed forward visibility. Lindbergh had navigated by periscope and dead reckoning, managing fuel expenditure with a meticulousness that would have seemed excessive to other pilots of that epoch. He landed at Le Bourget Field with 85 gallons remaining, having achieved fuel economy that experts had deemed unattainable for a Wright Whirlwind radial engine. That scrupulous attention to fuel management became Lindbergh's defining technical forte. Throughout the 1930s, as he conducted survey flights for Pan American Airways across the Pacific and Atlantic, Lindbergh perfected techniques that amplified range far beyond manufacturer specifications. He comprehended that stated range figures represented averages, not absolute limits. Every engine possessed an optimal operational envelope where power output, fuel consumption, and mechanical strain achieved a state of perfect equilibrium. Ascertaining that envelope necessitated understanding the interrelationship between manifold pressure, propeller revolutions per minute, mixture settings, and indicated airspeed in ways that transcended standard training. By 1944, Lindbergh had emerged as one of the world's foremost authorities on long-range flight, yet his relationship with the United States military was complicated by his pre-war isolationist stance. He had ardently advocated against American entanglement in European conflicts, leading the America First Committee and incurring the displeasure of President Franklin Roosevelt. On April 29, 1941, subsequent to Roosevelt's public comparison of him to a Civil War Confederate sympathizer, Lindbergh relinquished his Air Corps Reserve Colonel's commission. When Pearl Harbor compelled America into war, Lindbergh attempted to rejoin the Army Air Corps. Roosevelt personally ensured Lindbergh would not don an American military uniform again during the conflict. Nevertheless, expertise finds its avenues. Incapable of serving as a military officer, Lindbergh became a civilian technical consultant for aircraft manufacturers. He joined United Aircraft Corporation in 1943, collaborating extensively with their Chance Vought division, the producers of the F-4U Corsair. He spent time at Ford's Willow Run plant, resolving production issues with the B-24 Liberator. He undertook perilous high-altitude test flights in P-47 Thunderbolts for engine performance evaluations. He aided in developing dive-bombing tactics for the Corsair. His technical contributions were immense, yet Lindbergh yearned for combat. By early 1944, he perceived an opportunity. United Aircraft intended to assess the viability of a new twin-engine fighter, and the sole American representative of that category was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Lindbergh persuaded United Aircraft to dispatch him to the Pacific Theater as a technical representative to observe P-38 operations under combat conditions. On April 3, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for deployment to the South Pacific. He visited Brooks Brothers in New York to procure a naval officer's uniform devoid of insignia. At Brentano's bookstore, he purchased a small New Testament, inscribing in his journal that day, "Since I can only carry one book, and a very small one, that is my choice." It would not have been a decade ago, but the more I learn and the more I read, the less competition it has. He departed San Diego on April the 24th. Officially destined for Marine Corps aviation installations in the South Pacific region surrounding Guadalcanal. The expedition was sanctioned by the Navy Department but kept confidential from the White House. Neither President Roosevelt nor even Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox was aware Lindbergh was en route to the war zone. What began as an observational assignment evolved into something more when Marine Corps' aviation officers invited Lindbergh to fly as an observer on combat sorties. On May the 21st, 1944, Lindbergh undertook his inaugural combat mission, a strafing run with Marine Fighting Squadron 222 near the Japanese garrison at Rabaul. The Marines termed it observation. Lindbergh flew with his guns engaged, striking targets when the opportunity arose. He swiftly demonstrated practical proficiency that extended beyond theoretical knowledge. Collaborating with Corsair pilots, he showed them how to safely take off with bomb payloads, double the F-4U's rated capacity. The Marines had been losing aircraft due to accidents stemming from overweight conditions. Lindbergh's careful analysis of power settings, takeoff velocities, and weight distribution mitigated mishaps while enhancing strike capability. Word disseminated throughout the Pacific Theater that the celebrated aviator was participating in combat missions as a civilian and resolving operational challenges that had perplexed military pilots for months. By mid-June 1944, Lindbergh had developed an interest in the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft's focus on twin-engine fighters was legitimate. However, Lindbergh had also learned that the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, was among the most formidable Lightning outfits in the Pacific. If he wished to understand the P-38, that was the appropriate destination. On June 15, 1944, Lindbergh secured passage to Finchen, New Guinea. He announced his presence to 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nadzab, where Colonel Marion Cooper dined with him. On Sunday evening, June 18th, Lindbergh had supper with General Ennis Whitehead, discussing developments in New Guinea and his intentions to observe P-38 operations. The approval was informal, unofficial, and inadequate by stringent military standards. Yet, within the adaptable command structure of the Southwest Pacific Theater, personal connections and proven competence frequently held greater sway than administrative documentation. On June 20th, Lindbergh spent 1 hour and 20 minutes being checked out in a P-38 with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group. It was his initial experience in the distinctive twin-boom fighter. On June 26th, he flew to Hollandia and entered Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald's checkers game. MacDonald was 29 years old and already a 10-victory ace. He commanded the 475th Fighter Group, which had been activated in Australia on May 14, 1943. And had since become one of the highest-scoring P-38 units in the theater. The group's 3 squadrons, the 431st, 432nd, and 433rd, flew the latest P-38J models equipped with enhanced intercoolers and additional fuel capacity. These Lightnings represented the longest-range fighters in the Pacific, capable of missions that no other aircraft could undertake. However, even with external fuel tanks, The P-38's operational radius remained constrained. Missions to distant objectives afforded little fuel for aerial combat maneuvering, and pilots frequently returned to their bases with precariously low fuel reserves. Several aircraft had been lost when adverse weather necessitated detours that exceeded the aircraft's capabilities. MacDonald initially dismissed Lindbergh politely, returning to his checkers match. But when Lindbergh explained that General Hutchinson, commander of the 3rd Air Task Force, had dispatched him to confer on P-38 combat operations, MacDonald became attentive. Following a brief discussion, MacDonald inquired if Lindbergh would be amenable to flying a mission the following day. Lindbergh concurred. The mission was scheduled to commence at dawn. Rather than returning to headquarters, MacDonald suggested Lindbergh remain at the 475th's encampment to obviate transportation complications. As Lindbergh settled into the spare cot, news rapidly circulated throughout the unit. Charles Lindbergh was flying with Satan's Angels. The response among the pilots was varied. Lieutenant John Perdue of the 433rd Squadron anticipated meeting the legendary aviator. Others harbored skepticism. Some questioned whether a 42-year-old civilian, regardless of his fame, could manage modern combat. Major Thomas Maguire, already an ace with 15 victories who would conclude the war as America's second highest-scoring fighter pilot with 38 confirmed kills, was keen to observe the elder gentleman's capabilities. On the morning of June 27, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for his maiden P-38 combat sortie. The weather was inclement, with steady rain falling at 0530 hours. By 10:30, when the flight finally departed, conditions had improved. MacDonald led 4 aircraft toward Jeffman Island and Smart Airfield, customary targets for the 475th. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3, wingman to Maguire. The other aircraft was piloted by Merrill Smith, already an 8-victory ace. MacDonald observed Lindbergh seamlessly assume his position in perfect formation on Maguire's wing. For an individual who had only recently qualified in the P-38, his formation flying was impeccable. The mission entailed strafing an enemy barge in Kybos's Bay. Lindbergh maneuvered through anti-aircraft fire, his cannons and machine guns raking the target. The mission concluded successfully, and all 4 aircraft returned without incident. However, what the crew chiefs observed post-landing would prove more consequential than any combat engagement. When the ground crew inspected Lindbergh's P-38 subsequent to several missions, they detected a pattern. His aircraft consistently returned with substantially more fuel remaining than other pilots flying identical missions. Following a 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance mission on July 1st to enemy airstrips along Gilvink Bay's western shore, Lindbergh landed with 210 gallons of fuel aboard. Other pilots from the same mission returned with fuel gauges indicating near-empty tanks. On July 3rd, the group escorted 16 B-25 bombers on a strike against Jeffman Island. Following the assault, the Lightnings engaged in barge hunting. Within an hour, 2 pilots reported diminishing fuel levels and broke away for home. Lindbergh continued the mission, his fuel gauges displaying ample reserves. MacDonald noted the disparity and convened a meeting. 2 days after Lindbergh's arrival, the colonel assembled the 475th's pilots in their recreation hall. The facility was rudimentary, featuring packed dirt floors beneath a palm-thatched roof, a single ping-pong table, and several decks of cards as furnishings. Under harsh, unshaded light bulbs, MacDonald proceeded to business. He formally introduced Lindbergh and requested an explanation of how he consistently returned with more fuel than any other pilot in the group. What transpired next would alter P-38 operations throughout the Pacific Theater. Lindbergh stood before the assembled pilots and elucidated the cruise control methodologies he had devised for the Lightning. The standard operating procedure imparted to all P-38 pilots mandated cruising at 2,200 to 2,400 revolutions per minute with the mixture set to auto-reach. This setting provided adequate power and was deemed safe for the engines, but it was also inefficient. Lindbergh explained that by reducing engine speed from the standard 2,200 revolutions per minute down to 1,600 revolutions per minute, setting the fuel mixture to auto-lean rather than auto-rich, and slightly increasing manifold pressure to compensate for the reduced revolutions per minute, pilots could dramatically decrease fuel consumption without sacrificing effective cruise speed. The specific settings he advocated were 1,600 revolutions per minute at 30 inches of mercury manifold pressure with the mixture set to auto-lean and an indicated airspeed of 185 miles per hour. These settings reduced fuel consumption to approximately 70 gallons, achieving about 2 6/10 miles per gallon. Compared to standard cruise settings, which consumed considerably more fuel, the savings were substantial. Lindbergh predicted these techniques would extend the Lightning's radius by 400 miles, enabling 9-hour missions. When he concluded his presentation half an hour later, the room fell silent. The pilots pondered several disquieting considerations. The prospect of a 9-hour flight did not sit well with men who already found 7-hour missions arduous. The P-38 cockpit was confined. Pilots sat atop their parachutes with an emergency raft and oars stowed beneath. Their survival suits were uncomfortable. 7 hours in that cockpit was already straining human endurance limits. 9 hours seemed inconceivable. More troubling was Lindbergh's recommendation to operate engines at settings they had been specifically instructed to avoid. The combination of low revolutions per minute and high manifold pressure was termed running over square. Military flight training emphasized that over-square operation would result in engine damage. The resultant detonation would cause cylinder heads to overheat, leading to catastrophic engine failure. Pilots were taught that if manifold pressure exceeded revolutions per minute by more than a few inches, they risked engine blowouts. Now, this civilian was suggesting they routinely operate their engines under conditions they had been warned were perilous. The skepticism in the room was palpable. Several pilots exchanged glances, some shook their heads. One pilot openly declared Lindbergh's technique to be dangerous. However, MacDonald grasped a crucial point. Lindbergh was not speaking from theory. He had flown combat missions utilizing these settings. His P-38 had not experienced engine issues. His aircraft had repeatedly returned with fuel reserves that afforded operational flexibility unavailable to other pilots. The colonel resolved to subject the technique to a practical trial. If it proved effective, the 475th would possess a decisive operational advantage. If it failed, they would ascertain this promptly enough. Over the subsequent week, pilots began cautiously experimenting with Lindbergh's cruise settings. The initial flights were short, allowing pilots to return to base rapidly if engines exhibited signs of distress. The first pilots to attempt the technique reported nervously that their engines sounded different at the reduced revolutions per minute. The deep rumble of the Allison V1710 engines altered in character, but temperature gauges remained within normal parameters. Oil pressure stayed within acceptable ranges. Cylinder head temperatures, the critical indicator of detonation, actually ran cooler than at higher RPM settings. As confidence grew, pilots commenced employing Lindbergh's techniques on extended missions. The fuel savings were undeniable. Missions that had necessitated immediate return after target strikes could now incorporate extended combat air patrols. Flights that had compelled pilots to meticulously monitor fuel consumption now concluded with ample reserves. The P-38's effective combat radius, previously around 570 miles, expanded to 700 miles, then 750 miles. Pilots discovered they could reach targets that had been considered beyond the Lightning's capability, engage in combat for 15 minutes over the target area, and still return with a 1-hour fuel reserve. The transformation was revolutionary. The skepticism evaporated as mission after mission substantiated the technique's efficacy. Lindbergh flew regularly with the 475th, accumulating combat hours and leading by example. He commanded flights, demonstrating that the civilian observer could handle combat as capably as any military pilot. On missions he led, his call sign was simple: Mr. Lindbergh. Lindbergh explained the physics underpinning the technique in ways that aided pilots in comprehending its functionality. Aircraft engines generate power by combusting fuel to create pressure that drives pistons. The quantity of fuel consumed per unit of time determines fuel expenditure. The objective is to maximize efficiency, producing the greatest power for the least fuel. Conventional high RPM cruise settings yielded considerable power but wasted fuel because the engine cycled rapidly, burning fuel unnecessarily. By reducing RPM and increasing manifold pressure, equivalent power could be generated with fewer combustion cycles, each utilizing fuel more efficiently. The lean mixture setting further enhanced efficiency by supplying just enough fuel for complete combustion, eliminating the excess employed in auto-rich mode for engine cooling at high power settings. The engines did not detonate because the power setting, though over square by ratio, was not actually high power operation. A manifold pressure of 30 inches was moderate, well below the 60-inch war emergency power settings utilized for takeoff and combat. The reduced ARP actually lessened mechanical strain on engine components. The technique was not inherently dangerous. It was simply distinct from what pilots had been instructed. Lindbergh's expertise derived from years of experience with long-range flight. His 1927 Atlantic crossing had taught him that published specifications were starting points, not limitations. His work with Pan American Airways in the 1930s, surveying trans-Pacific and transatlantic routes, had provided him with thousands of hours to experiment with fuel management. The P-38 possessed an advantage that rendered experimentation less perilous than it appeared: twin engines. If one engine suffered damage from the experimental cruise technique, the other engine could bring the pilot home. Across the vast Pacific, where mechanical failure meant succumbing to drowning or capture by the Japanese, most pilots in single-engine fighters flew conservatively. However, the P-38's redundancy created a margin for safely exploring the operational envelope, and Lindbergh understood from the supply situation that the risk was acceptable. Allison was shipping spare V-1710 engines and parts to the Pacific in ample quantities. Should an engine require replacement following experimental operation, ground crews could expeditiously install a fresh power plant. The operational benefit of extended range justified accepting a minimal risk of increased engine wear. The calculation proved accurate. No P-38 engines failed due to Lindbergh's cruise techniques. By late July 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control techniques were disseminating throughout 5th Air Force P-38 units. The success of the 475th Fighter Group was impossible to disregard. Word spread to other squadrons. Pilots conversed. Ground crews compared fuel consumption data. Other commanders desired the same operational advantage that Satan's angels now possessed. Lindbergh conducted additional presentations for pilots from other units. He explained the technique patiently, addressing technical inquiries and assuaging concerns regarding engine safety. The adoption was not instantaneous or universal, but it was consistent. July 28, 1944, marked Lindbergh's most significant engagement with the 475th. The mission involved bomber escort to the Saram area, flying with the 433rd Squadron. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3 in a 4-ship formation over El Puti Bay. Blue Flight encountered enemy aircraft. 2 Mitsubishi Kai-51 Sone, Japanese light bombers utilized for reconnaissance and ground attack, were returning from a search for a missing comrade. The Sones belonged to the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai. One was piloted by the unit's commanding officer, Captain Saburo Shimada, the other by Sergeant Yokogi. The American fighters attacked. The Sones were outmatched. Slower, with reduced agility and minimal armament when contrasted with the Lightnings, they should have been straightforward targets. However, Shimada was an accomplished aviator with no inclination to meet an easy end. The engagement devolved into a protracted aerial chase. The P-38s belonging to the 9th Fighter Squadron were the first to locate the Sonias and were already engaged when MacDonald's squadron arrived. Shimada's wingman, Sergeant Yokogi, was struck by cannon fire from Lieutenant Wade Lewis. The Sonia's port wing ignited. As the adversary aircraft leveled out for a retreat, Lieutenant J.C. Haslip maneuvered behind and unleashed a sustained barrage. The damaged Sonya trailed smoke before plummeting into the ocean. Shimada's Sonya persisted in the confrontation. For a duration of 30 minutes, the Japanese captain skillfully evaded multiple P-38s that attempted to intercept him. He contorted his aircraft into severe banks, the wingtips shedding condensation as he pushed the Sonya through its maximum rate turns. The P-38 pilots attempted to lead their targets, but struggled to maintain a steady aim. The comparatively slower Japanese aircraft could outturn the swifter American fighters. Captain Danforth Miller, McDonald's wingman, briefly managed to acquire the Sonya in his gun sight but lost it when Shimada executed a sharp left turn. Miller's tracer rounds fell 80 feet behind. Shimada then performed an unexpected maneuver. Instead of continuing his evasive actions, he turned directly towards the approaching Lindbergh. The two aircraft hurtled towards each other head-on, closing at a speed approaching 500 miles per hour. For Lindbergh, a pilot with thousands of hours of flight experience but who had never encountered an enemy aircraft actively trying to end his life, the moment became starkly clear with a terrifying lucidity. Shimada maintained his course. Whether intending a ramming maneuver or simply aiming to exchange fire directly, the Japanese captain was committed to a collision trajectory. Lindbergh, acting on instinct, focused his aim on the Sonya's radial engine and squeezed his trigger. The P-38's formidable weaponry, comprising one 20mm cannon and four 50-caliber machine guns concentrated in the nose, unleashed a furious volley for 6 seconds. Lindbergh held the trigger down continuously. Rounds and shells impacted the front of the Sonya with brutal force. The Mitsubishi's propeller visibly decelerated. Smoke billowed from the engine, yet Shimada held his course. At the last possible instant, Lindbergh pulled up with extreme force, his P-38 soaring over the damaged Sonya with mere feet to spare. Shimada's aircraft plunged into a steep dive. Other P-38s unleashed further bursts of fire. The Sonya continued its descent, trailing smoke until it impacted the ocean at high velocity. A plume of white spray marked the point of collision. Foam spread in concentric circles across the water's surface. Then, the waves smoothed, returning the sea to its prior state. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were deceased. Back at the base, the assignment of credit for the kill was debated. Numerous pilots had achieved hits on the Sonya. McDonald, Miller, and Lindbergh had all scored strikes, but it was Lindbergh's head-on volley that had critically crippled the aircraft, slowing its propeller and initiating the fatal dive. Informally, the pilots reached a consensus. Lindbergh had achieved his inaugural and sole confirmed aerial victory. This triumph was not officially recorded in the 475th's operational logbooks. Lindbergh was a civilian. His presence in combat was already irregular. Documenting an official kill would have raised questions potentially curtailing his involvement with the unit. 3 days later, on the 1st of August, Lindbergh narrowly escaped death. The mission was a fighter sweep towards the Palau Islands. The flight encountered Japanese Zeros. In the ensuing aerial engagement, Lindbergh found himself in a turning fight with a Zero pilot who very nearly shot him down. Only the intervention of McDonald, who shouted, break right," and then engaged the Zero himself, saved Lindbergh's life. This close call convinced 5th Air Force Headquarters that enough was enough. Lindbergh had demonstrated the efficacy of his methods. He had completed approximately 50 combat missions throughout his service in the Pacific, including around 25 P-38 sorties with the 475th. He had successfully downed an enemy aircraft. He had come perilously close to losing his own life. It was time for him to return to the United States before an irreversible incident occurred. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh departed Hollandia to begin his journey home. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group assembled to bid him farewell. Their respect for the civilian technical representative was genuine. He had not only imparted techniques that extended their operational range, He had flown alongside them, battled with them, and proven his worth in circumstances where rank and renown held no sway. The impact of Lindbergh's fuel efficiency strategies extended far beyond the confines of the 475th Fighter Group. By October 1944, P-38 units across the Pacific were implementing variations of his cruise control settings. The precise figures varied slightly between units and operational conditions, but the underlying principle remained universal. Reduced engine revolutions per minute, elevated manifold pressure, and a leaner fuel mixture all combined to dramatically increase flight range. The operational ramifications were profound. Targets that had previously been inaccessible became reachable. Japanese bases that had enjoyed impunity from fighter escorts now faced P-38s equipped with sufficient fuel to engage over the target area and return to base safely. The enhanced range enabled fighters to escort bombers on missions that had previously been undertaken without escort, or not at all. Long-range fighter sweeps could penetrate deeper into Japanese-controlled territories. The P-38 groups stationed in Dutch New Guinea soon found themselves undertaking missions to targets 950 miles distant, engaging for 15 minutes, and then returning to their operational bases. Such missions had been inconceivable prior to Lindbergh's techniques becoming standard practice. The extension of range was not a minor adjustment. In the latter half of 1944, the augmented combat radius facilitated operations that directly supported MacArthur's westward advance towards the Philippines. Airfields that would have been unsupportable with existing fighter ranges became viable forward operating bases. Invasion plans that had necessitated waiting for the establishment of closer airfields could proceed with greater alacrity. The strategic significance was measured not solely in miles, but in time. Operations that might have spanned months were accomplished in mere weeks due to the ability of fighter cover to reach farther and faster. The technique also served to preserve lives. Pilots who previously returned to base with fuel gauges indicating near emptiness now possessed reserves for unforeseen emergencies. Adverse weather conditions that necessitated flight path deviations no longer posed a guarantee of aircraft loss. Pilots who sustained battle damage possessed improved chances of reaching friendly territory. The fuel reserves provided a crucial safety buffer that directly reduced combat-related losses stemming from non-combat causes. The extended range proved particularly advantageous during the liberation of the Philippines. When MacArthur's forces launched their invasion of Leyte in October 1944, P-38s operating from bases in New Guinea and Morotai provided vital fighter cover over distances that had been unattainable mere months prior. The distinction between reaching the target with minimal or no fuel reserves and arriving with an hour of fuel on board meant the critical difference between providing effective protective cover and merely making a perfunctory appearance. Nevertheless, the adoption of these methods was not without its challenges. Certain commanders initially resisted, voicing concerns regarding engine durability. Some pilots remained skeptical, placing greater faith in their established training than in a civilian's counsel. A few maintenance officers expressed apprehension about increased engine wear. However, the empirical evidence was irrefutable. Units employing Lindbergh's techniques reported no escalation in engine failures. Fuel consumption data unequivocally demonstrated significant improvements. Mission reports documented successful operations that had previously been deemed impossible. By the close of 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control methodology was formally integrated into P-38 operational protocols. What had originated as an observation by a civilian technical representative had evolved into established doctrine. The United States Army Air Forces disseminated updated cruise control charts for the P-38, incorporating Lindbergh's findings. Pilot training materials were revised to include instruction on proper lean-of-peak mixture operation. The broader narrative of Lindbergh's wartime service in the Pacific unveils an individual motivated by complex underlying factors. His pre-war isolationist stance had rendered him a contentious figure. His pronouncements regarding aviation technology in Nazi Germany had led to accusations of pro-Nazi sympathies. His public opposition to America's entry into World War II had irrevocably damaged his relationship with President Roosevelt. With the onset of hostilities, Lindbergh found himself ostracized, despite being one of America's most celebrated aviators. Yet, in the Pacific Theater, far removed from the machinations of Washington politics, Lindbergh discovered a path to redemption through his technical proficiency. The pilots of the Marine Corps and Army Air Forces who flew with him judged him not by his political affiliations, but by his flying prowess and his courage. Major Richard Bong, America's most decorated ace with 40 victories achieved while serving with V Fighter Command headquarters and various units across the theater, remarked to a United Press reporter that Lindbergh was as formidable a pilot as any of them. He would have been out there neutralizing the Japanese every day had General Kenny permitted him. Such an assessment from an individual of Bong's standing carried more weight than any form of political absolution could have provided. Lindbergh had validated himself in the arena where validation mattered most: combat. Following his return to the United States in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh continued to make significant technical contributions to the war effort. In October 1944, he participated in a joint Army-Navy conference focused on fighter aircraft performance at Naval Air Station, Potent River, Maryland. He flew and evaluated captured Japanese aircraft, offering crucial insights into enemy capabilities. He continued his consulting work for United Aircraft and other manufacturers, addressing technical challenges encountered in combat. The technical specifications illustrating Lindbergh's accomplishments underscore the magnitude of the improvements achieved. The P-38J Lightning possessed an internal fuel capacity of 410 gallons in its standard configuration, comprising two 90-gallon main tanks, two 60-gallon reserve tanks, and two 55-gallon leading-edge tanks, with provisions for external drop tanks. The total fuel capacity could exceed 1,000 gallons at standard cruise settings of 2,200 RPM and auto-reach mixture. Fuel consumption varied depending on the source, but was considerably higher than that achieved with Lindbergh's method. Lindbergh's technique reduced fuel consumption to approximately 70 gallons per hour in total. The combat radius increased from approximately 570 miles to 750 miles, maintaining equivalent combat and reserve fuel allowances, representing a 31% enhancement. For missions demanding maximum range, the incorporation of auxiliary drop tanks in conjunction with his cruise techniques enabled flights approaching 9 hours in duration, covering over 1,000 miles. These enhanced capabilities fundamentally transformed operations in the Pacific. The strategic island-hopping campaign that characterized MacArthur's progression through New Guinea and into the Philippines was critically dependent on achieving air superiority at each stage. Fighter aircraft range dictated which islands could be bypassed and which necessitated direct assault to establish necessary airfields. By extending fighter range, Lindbergh's methodologies facilitated bolder operational planning. Islands that would have demanded costly amphibious assaults could be circumvented because fighters could project power from more distant bases. Some historical accounts have erroneously attributed Lindbergh's range extension techniques to the April 1943 mission that successfully intercepted and shot down Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport aircraft. That particular mission, executed by P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron based at Guadalcanal, did push the Lightning's range limitations to their extreme, but Lindbergh had no involvement in it. He did not arrive in the Pacific Theater until well over a year later. What Lindbergh contributed was the crucial element of making such extreme range operations a routine occurrence rather than an exceptional feat. The human dimension of Lindbergh's achievements warrants particular emphasis. He was 42 years old when he deployed to the Pacific Theater. He flew combat missions against pilots who were 20 years his junior. The physical rigors of combat maneuvering, the immense stress of aerial engagements, and the discomfort of 7 to 10 hours within a confined cockpit all took their toll. Yet Lindbergh never sought preferential treatment. He undertook the same missions, faced the identical dangers, and adhered to the same operational procedures as the young lieutenants and captains who constituted the majority of the pilots. His readiness to personally demonstrate and validate his techniques was instrumental in their acceptance. Had he merely lectured on fuel management from the relative safety of a headquarters office, pilots would have likely dismissed him as another theorist detached from the realities of combat. By participating in missions and consistently proving the effectiveness of his methods, he garnered a level of credibility that no amount of rank or fame could have conferred. The psychological impact of Lindbergh's success transcended mere fuel management. He unequivocally demonstrated that civilian technical expertise held significant value in operational combat scenarios. Military organizations inherently prioritize rank and combat experience, but the complexities of modern warfare necessitated technical sophistication that frequently resided outside the established military command structure. Lindbergh proved that civilians possessing specialized knowledge could make meaningful contributions to combat effectiveness if afforded the opportunity. His success encouraged military commanders to actively solicit input from civilian technical representatives affiliated with aircraft manufacturers, engine companies, and various research organizations. The enhanced collaboration between military end users and civilian developers significantly accelerated the pace of technological innovation throughout the duration of the war. The P-38 Lightning itself merits recognition as the aircraft that made Lindbergh's techniques feasible. Its twin-engine configuration offered essential redundancy, enhancing the safety of experimental approaches. The Allison V-1710 engines, despite occasional criticisms regarding various issues, responded favorably to meticulous mixture management. The P-38's sophisticated fuel system, complete with its multiple tanks and integral transfer pumps, allowed pilots to exercise precise control over fuel distribution. The aircraft's inherent stability rendered it well suited for extended cruise flight durations. By late 1944 and early 1945, the P-38 was being superseded in certain theaters by the P-51 Mustang, an aircraft that offered superior performance at higher altitudes and extended range with an equivalent fuel load. However, within the Pacific theater, the P-38 maintained its crucial role throughout the remainder of the conflict. Its twin engines provided essential safety margins over extensive bodies of water. Its formidable armament delivered devastating destructive power. Its maneuverability at low to medium altitudes proved ideally suited to the prevailing combat conditions in the Pacific, and its range, particularly when optimized through Lindbergh's techniques, remained exceptionally impressive. The final statistical data eloquently narrates the story. The 475th Fighter Group, exclusively operating P-38s, amassed a total of 551 aerial victories, establishing it as the foremost P-38 unit of the war. America's second highest scoring ace, Major Thomas Maguire, with 38 confirmed kills, flew P-38s with the 475th. The aircraft's synergistic combination of range, firepower, and reliability solidified its position as the dominant fighter in the theater, and the augmented range provided by Lindbergh's techniques amplified every facet of P-38 operations. Missions could extend farther, engagements could be sustained longer, and returns to base were made safer. The cumulative effect across thousands of sorties and hundreds of thousands of flight hours was immeasurable, yet undeniably real. This narrative also underscores the often uncomfortable dynamic between specialized expertise and established institutional structures. Lindbergh's pre-war political affiliations had rendered him unwelcome in official military capacities. President Roosevelt's personal animosity precluded Lindbergh from serving in a uniformed capacity. Nevertheless, the Army Air Forces urgently required the very expertise that Lindbergh possessed. The resolution, an unofficial civilian status with tacit authorization to participate in combat operations, was irregular and would likely contravene contemporary regulations. However, it proved effective. Institutional rigidity yielded to the pragmatic demands of operational necessity. The resulting outcome provided an incalculable benefit to the war effort. The men who flew alongside Lindbergh in 1944 never forgot the invaluable lessons he imparted. In interviews conducted decades later, former 475th pilots spoke with profound respect about the civilian who had flown as their equal and taught them to extend their flight capabilities far beyond what they had previously believed possible. Colonel Warren Lewis, who commanded the 432nd Squadron, recalled Lindbergh's fuel-saving settings with remarkable precision even decades later. The specific details varied somewhat in different accounts, reflecting adaptations to diverse conditions and aircraft models, but the fundamental principle remained universal and the results were indisputable. Charles Augustus Lindbergh passed away on August 26, 1974, at the age of 72, succumbing to lymphoma at his residence in Kipahulu, Maui. He had departed from Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York on August 17th, arriving in Maui just 1 week prior to his death. He was interred approximately 3 hours after his passing in a simple, handmade coffin constructed by Hawaiian ranch cowboys dressed in their work attire, within a grave 30 feet deep, lined with lava rock and black beach pebbles at Palapalahū Church Cemetery. Only 15 individuals attended the ceremony. The grave marker is a plain concrete slab bearing an epitaph from Psalm 139. "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." His wartime journals, published in 1970, offered detailed accounts of his service in the Pacific, including his tenure with the 475th. The enduring legacy of Lindbergh's Pacific service extends beyond the specific techniques he introduced. He elucidated principles that continue to hold relevance. Technical expertise is paramount in combat operations. Civilian specialists can make substantial contributions when provided with opportunities. Institutional protocols should be subject to rigorous examination and improvement when empirical evidence supports such modifications. Personal demonstration proves more persuasive than abstract theoretical arguments. And perhaps most significantly, there remains perpetual scope for enhancement, even within systems that appear fully optimized. In the final analysis, Lindbergh's accomplishments in the Pacific represent a singular convergence of specialized knowledge and operational imperative. The Pacific theater demanded extreme range from fighter aircraft. Existing protocols restricted this range below the aircraft's inherent technical capabilities. Lindbergh possessed unique insights into fuel management, stemming from his lifelong focus on efficiency cultivated over decades. He was afforded the opportunity to apply this expertise under combat conditions where outcomes could be objectively quantified. He exhibited the courage to personally demonstrate his techniques, risking his own life to validate his theories. And he possessed the interpersonal approach to collaborate with pilots as an equal, rather than demanding recognition based on his prior fame. The accounts of German prisoners of war observing America's industrial might illustrate a psychological transformation driven by overwhelming material evidence. Lindbergh's narrative exemplifies technical transformation achieved through demonstrably applied expertise. Both instances reveal that, on occasion, the most significant triumphs arise not through the application of force, but through knowledge meticulously applied and substantiated through practical example. The German prisoners returned home with a profound understanding that democratic prosperity could foster abundance. The American fighter pilots who learned from Lindbergh acquired techniques that amplified their operational effectiveness while simultaneously ensuring their safe return. The P-38 Lightning continued to serve until the war's conclusion. Its distinctive twin-boom silhouette became an emblematic representation of American air power in the Pacific. The pilots who flew it recall the aircraft with genuine affection, notwithstanding its occasional eccentricities and challenges. And those who piloted it in 1944 and beyond also remember the civilian who taught them that the seemingly impossible was merely difficult, that published limitations represented starting points rather than absolute boundaries, and that comprehension could unlock capabilities previously concealed in plain sight. This is Lindbergh's enduring Pacific legacy, not measured by combat victories or missions flown, but by the knowledge disseminated and the techniques imparted. He arrived as an observer and departed as an instructor, He entered as a celebrity and left as a comrade. And he transformed the capabilities of an aircraft through nothing more than a profound understanding of its true operational parameters and the courage to prove that superior methods existed. The pilots of Satan's angels understood the invaluable gift Lindbergh had bestowed upon them. They flew farther, fought more effectively, and returned more safely, due to knowledge freely shared by a civilian who possessed an unparalleled mastery of fuel efficiency within the Pacific theater. That knowledge, validated in combat and widely adopted across the theater, represents one of the most impactful technical innovations of the Pacific Air War. And it originated not from sterile laboratory engineering departments, but from the singular, specialized mastery of an art form that he had perfected 17 years earlier over the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The expertise demonstrated in a distinct situation with varied planes proved equally beneficial in 1944, just as it had been in 1927. The fundamental concept endured: a thorough comprehension of the aircraft, meticulous management of available assets, and a perpetual refusal to acknowledge published boundaries as absolute restrictions. Lindbergh embodied this philosophy, and for a period of 6 weeks during the summer of 1944, he imparted this wisdom to some of the most skilled aviators in the Pacific theater. These pilots subsequently educated others, propagating insights that reshaped America's aerial combat strategy in the Pacific.